Hello and welcome to Stowe Talks, a podcast designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all the challenges this brings. I'm Matty Taylor.
And I'm Liza Gatchell, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law. And today we're looking at the first things you should do if you are getting divorced. So this is quite a big subject. I think it's a major worry for people, and often the first meeting or the first telephone call, it will be I just don't know where to start. I don't know what to look at. We've got two different types of people in these circumstances usually. I mean, sometimes it can be a mutual decision, but often one party may have made the decision to separate, and so they might be coming at it from slightly different perspectives. Yeah. What's your first thing? What do you think they should do first before anything else, Matt?
I think usually first is take a little bit of time and breathe, actually. Sometimes we get calls from clients who say, I told my spouse yesterday, or I heard from my spouse yesterday that they want to get a divorce, and you think that's not long enough for you to process this and to suddenly start, understanding the legal process when you are, probably going through a bit of trauma, and your head will be all over the place, and there's too much going on. So I think the first thing to do is just take a breath. Generally, you don't need to go that quickly. Sometimes it can be if you've got concerns about, financial skullduggery, or there's jurisdiction issues, or you've got any urgent, kind of children safeguarding worries. But assuming that there's no kind of desperate things, there's no domestic abuse that requires urgent attention, and you are just having to process the actual fact of the end of a relationship, I think taking time is so important. And jumping in and speaking to a lawyer, I think maybe isn't counterproductive, but I don't think you get the benefit from doing it straight away. And I think that's especially the case if you're on the receiving end of the news. If you are the person who's just been told by your partner that they want to end the marriage, or they want to separate and consider things at least, especially if that's come out the blue completely. But even if it hasn't, even if you've got an inkling, you're going to be further behind in that cheesy old X Factor reference here, emotional journey. And it's going to take you a bit of a while to catch up and be able to process things. So I think that's the first thing. I mean,
I'd agree. I mean, I think divorce and separation is almost akin to a bereavement, isn't it? In a certain circumstance, in a lot of circumstances. And the emotional impact of that can actually take quite a long time to get over. And when we start looking at finances and all the rest of it, that requires a lot of brain power, if you like, and focus and attention. And sometimes you just need to take that breath and get the support for your emotions before you can be in the right headspace to deal with the other things. Otherwise, you can end up going around in circles or not dealing with things productively. And I mean, there's a huge amount of support out there now for people. Great to chat to friends, family, build your support network. The only thing that I would say is do not take legal advice from them.
Absolutely.
Just because your neighbour's divorce or your friend's divorce went a certain way doesn't mean that yours is, and you need to make sure that the advice that you're getting is specific to your situation. There's usually local counselling services that you can access through your GP, which are usually free to look at, or you might have a service through your work that you're able to look at. I think it is really just about getting yourself in that right frame of mind.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of like subjective emotional support and objective emotional support. So your subjective emotional support is that support network that you've just spoken about, your family, your friends, people who are going to support you in what you say. So if you want to go and rant about your ex, then they will support you and tell you what a terrible person they are. And I think that's fine. And I think that's valid. And I think if you need that, that is absolutely fine. But I think you also need to counterbalance that with objective support. And that can be, it can be a divorce coach. It can be a therapist. It can be a counsellor. It can be listening to every episode of this podcast, which of course you absolutely should.
100%.
Entirely unbiased and, 5-star reviews while you're doing it, please. But, getting that objective support where it's not about the person. It's not necessarily so much about validating your own views, although that's important. It's about encouraging you to examine your own views and to look at the process and look at things that are going to help you to heal. So I think that's a sort of difference. I think too much of one probably isn't right. I don't think you can exclusively do it the objective way. And I think it's really important to be able to, have a bottle of wine or a pint, or you go for a walk with someone and just let rip and rant and have someone who will, has got your back because they are team you. Your sister, your mum, whoever it is. But I think having that balance is super important. So there's different things, we divorce coaches who will are obviously very specialist. There are counsellors and therapists who've got more of a kind of medical approach to things, probably, and that might be more appropriate in certain circumstances, particularly if you are struggling with your sort of mental health in general. Maybe you've spoken to your GP. And then there's loads of resources online as well, aren't there? There's going. I think that's the sort of maybe the next step after that is once you've dealt with the initial, and not fully dealt with, but started to deal with the initial emotional reaction. Knowledge is key, isn't it? So starting to equip yourself can be helpful.
And I know we're biased, but the Stowe support section of our website has a lot of really useful information, videos, blogs written by lawyers, and it can be really helpful just to dive in there and get a little bit of information.
Yeah. This is a very biased Stowe supporting podcast, obviously. But yeah, there's brilliant stuff there. But there are lots of other law firms who've got, in absolute fairness, there's lots of other law firms who provide blogs and things all the time. And whether it's about an overview of the divorce process or about how you deal with your emotions and things, there's loads of good stuff out there. I mean, Google's Google, and there's loads of stuff that maybe isn't so great out there. So, I'd be wary about latching onto something because it says something that you think you want to hear about your situation necessarily.
Yeah, check your sources. I think, if you're going to be doing a Google search that brings up sort of 10 million different outcomes for the word divorce, just make sure that the website that you're landing on, the place that you're getting that information from, first of all, is relevant to the jurisdiction that you're in and you're not reading something in relation to America or somewhere else. And secondly, that it's a viable source. It is a law firm website or a government website or a charity that specialises in this area, so that you can be fairly secure with the information you're receiving.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be very cautious about some of the sort of forum type responses, chat rooms, that sort of thing. Social media is obviously, some good stuff, but it can be a bit of Wild West out there. So yeah, definitely checking your sources is good. When
you're looking at sort of the, what do you do, and is it different if you're the person that has decided that you wanted to end the relationship as opposed to the person that's been told that the relationship's ended? I don't think there's a huge amount of difference as to what you need to do in next steps. The only thing that I would say is that if you are the person that has decided that your relationship has broken down, do not threaten divorce to the other party unless you are 100% happy to go, prepared to go through that. Because sometimes I think that does get thrown around, particularly in the heat of an argument, and it can really set things at a really poor tone to begin with. So just don't throw that out there.
Completely. You don't. I mean, making threats generally isn't a good way to operate, but that's a sort of fairly nuclear option. And I think something that the instigating party needs to bear in mind is, they are going to be more prepared to move on to the next stage, and their spouse probably needs more time to deal with things. Let's say someone has just said they want to separate, but that hasn't come about overnight. The person who wants out has probably spent months and months thinking about this, and taken a while to come to that decision. The spouse might have felt there was something wrong and might be some way along that process, but is unlikely to be at the same stage. So if you've already taken 6 months to go, I want to get divorced, and it's brand new news to your husband who you're about to leave, you can't then get frustrated, I don't think. And people do, and it's understandable, and no one's perfect. But if you're getting frustrated a month later when nothing's happened, you've got to then remember you're 7 months down that process and your husband's 1 month down that process. And that's a huge amount of time to process things. So I think some understanding that, and different people operate at different timeframes. Maybe that person can adjust in a month, but maybe that person needs a year because of the way that they're wired. So I think some understanding and appreciation that, not everyone does things at the same time can really help, because that can be something that really ratchets up the temperature, which makes things more complicated, take longer, and cost more money in the long run, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you sort of got on the same page-ish in terms of time frame with your partner, and you're looking to move things along, you've got a bit of that knowledge, you feel like your emotional support's okay, and you're ready to sort of progress things. What's next, Lisa?
I think there's two things. Well, let's say there's three things. Let's go through it. So the first one is, if we're talking about divorce and finances, so particularly if we're looking at finances, start to get an idea of what the finances are. So start to gather your documents, because you will be asked that. When you go and see a solicitor, they're going to ask you roughly how much do you think your house is worth, roughly how much do you think is outstanding on your mortgage, what are the pensions, is there a business, all of these types of questions. So if you can just start to put that together, I think that will help you in the long run, because you'll be able to sort of front load some of that stuff. The other one then is in relation to children and really focusing on the children within all conversations that you're having. And then the third one I would say is getting legal advice. So once you're emotionally ready and you've decided that, this is the route that you're going to go down, and you've started to get an idea of, what the children's needs are in this, what the financial assets are, that's when you need to sit down with an independent lawyer so that they can go through the process with you and give you an idea of, based on your circumstances, what they think the next steps will be for you.
Yeah, I think that's right. So maybe if we sort of take those in turn, the finances is getting your ducks in a row and knowing what you're doing. There's obviously the issue about kind of sorting out what we call the interim finances, isn't there? So, what do people need to bear in mind about, yes, we can move to looking at what happened, who's going to keep the house, is a house going to be sold, what happens with savings, pensions, yada, 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 all that good stuff. We can deal with that in the long run. What about the kind of the interim thing? Because a lot of people's thoughts is, well, what happens? How are we paying the mortgage? What are we doing with the bills? What's your feelings on that, Lisa, about what people should be doing to kind of prepare themselves for that?
I mean, I guess one thing to say is, if you're the person that's instigating the divorce and you have had a period of time to think about it, this is perhaps something that you want to think about, particularly if you are the financially weaker party. So are you able to put some funds to one side to cover a couple of months, so that if once the news is out, the other party becomes spiteful or tries to cut off money or anything else, you've got a bit of a safety net there. Obviously, that's much more difficult if you're on the receiving end of that news, because you haven't got that opportunity to plan. But that's something definitely to bear in mind if you are the one that's instigating the divorce in the first instance. And then as far as the interim plans go, I mean, predominantly they should stay as they are until we work out what the long-term arrangements are. So, if one party's paid the mortgage, or the mortgage has been split equally, or whatever it is that you've been doing, that's been working for you during your relationship. You've probably come to those plans because of each of your incomes and the household outgoings, etc., and that should continue. Now, obviously, that becomes more difficult if one party vacates the family home, because they're then having to pay rent, unlikely mortgage, but potentially more, usually rent somewhere else, and they're having to pay their own council tax and gas and electric, and therefore the amount of available money that we have has shrunk dramatically. And there is an element in a lot of circumstances there where both parties are going to have to cut their cloth a bit in the interim. We're looking at what are the basic needs, and it may be that year you have to go without a holiday, or the car can't be upgraded because we need to concentrate on the funds that are available and keeping things as afloat as we can whilst we work out what the long-term solution will be. Now, if you get to a stage where you can't agree, what should be paid, one party's left, we are very much looking at it from okay, what's your income? What's both of your incomes? What are both of your outgoings? Does one of you have a surplus and one of you have a deficit? And if you do, that's kind of where an interim maintenance claim would come in. Interim maintenance claims are costly, they're complicated, they add additional stress to the proceedings, and are genuinely not a route that you want to go down unless you absolutely have to. But if you're in a circumstance where money has been cut off and you don't have the money to pay your mortgage and your bills, or to buy food, then obviously that's a route that you're going to have to go down, and that route is available for you with the courts.
Yeah, completely. It's one of the worst things to litigate. Be sensible, be normal.
And it's win or lose, and there's cost risks to it as well. I mean, it's risky.
And it's very easy to spend more on costs than you're going to recover. So, we don't do a lot of them, but it's something that does, I guess, figure in kind of correspondence and try and sort outside court. I think that's all really sensible advice. I think that my own sort of personal view, and it's obviously very different for different circumstances, and this isn't going to be right for everyone. My own view is that before you get into sorting out the long-term finances. Obviously, you need the interim finances sorted and try and maintain the status quo, cut your cloth, all of that. Try and be sensible, try and be normal about it, and be as collaborative as you can. But the priority is, if you have children, is to get your children to adjust to the new normal. If one of you has moved out the family home, the kids are going to need some time to adjust to that. How often are they spending with the other party? Where's it going to be? What overnights coming in? Check that they're settled at school. Check that their teachers know what's going on, so that they can have a look out for them. Think, is there anyone else in your kid's life who needs to know? Because different people take different things. Some people will go and openly say to everyone, we're separating, and that's fine. Other people are more private. But especially if you don't necessarily want the word to get out, there are probably some people in your kid's life who would be helpful to know. So, are they in Beavers or Brownies or Cubs, and do they have a group leader? Is that their thing and they love that? Maybe worth having a little chat with the group leader, because that's the sort of person who they might confide to, or they might notice a change in behaviour. Football coaches, gymnastics coaches, whatever your kid's activity is, that can be useful. Also, best friends, parents can be really useful to kind of have that conversation and say, listen, and especially if, I think a lot of kids will have a best friend who they fall out with quite regularly. And if you have that sort of combustible best friend relationship, and your kid could sometimes get a bit upset by the way that they are spoken to by their best mate, and then it all blows over, it's just sometimes worth saying to the other parent, listen, there's this stuff at home. Little Johnny might be a bit more sensitive than normal. If you find out that there's anything wrong, just let us know. So my thing would be to, before delving into stuff that can be incredibly contentious about what you do in the house and stuff, give your kids time to adjust and react and be open and speak to you about it. So I think I guess if that's kind of two of the points, then we're into then looking at the longer term stuff. So we've done a little bit on this before about your sort of first meeting with the lawyer. Probably helpful to do a little bit of a recap of that, I think.
Yeah, can do.
Yeah, as Lisa said, you want to have an idea of your assets and things. I think there are a couple of key things that you need to bear in mind when you're first speaking to a lawyer. First, the first lawyer you speak to might not be the lawyer for you. And it's okay to go and speak to a lawyer and think, it didn't really click with them. No lawyer is the right lawyer for everyone. I'm not the right lawyer for everyone. There's certain ways that we are, and a lot of it's so personal, and you need to click with them and feel like there's someone that you can talk to. So I think the first meet with a lawyer is probably really intimidating for a lot of people. Aside from maybe buying a house, probably doing a will, probably not really engaged with a lawyer before, and certainly most people won't have got in something that is, has the potential to end in litigation. So I think clients often feel a bit on the back foot, a bit vulnerable, and a bit like it's all a bit scary. But I think what clients need to understand is that they have quite a lot of power in these meetings. And yes, they're there to listen and things, but the best initial meetings with clients are when they sort of dictate things a little bit, and they can say, here's what I want. These are my concerns. I'll always ask the client, what do you want? What I can tell you about the law if you want me to tell you about the law and talk to you about the process. I can do all of that. What are your concerns? And being able to have that conversation and really get a feel for, is this someone who I can relate to? Is this lawyer someone who I feel has got my back? Is this someone who's honest with me? Is this someone who is listening to what I'm saying, or are they just on autopilot giving their advice? Do you click? Is the person, did you manage to have like a bit of a laugh together and get on well? Or conversely, did you find they were a bit flippant and you want someone a bit more formal? I think that's some really useful stuff. And to go away and have that first meeting, that first call, whatever it is, and then take a decision. And if you feel that lawyer isn't for you, there was something that put you off them, there's another lawyer who'll be really good, either in the same firm, you can request that, or in another firm. I mean, what do you think about, aside from the sort of nitty gritty about houses and pensions and all that jazz, Lisa, what makes a really effective kind of first meeting, that if someone is a bit scared and unsure of the process, how can they make the best of that?
First of all, they can bring someone with them. So if they're really nervous about obviously not their ex-partner, unless you're doing the sort of two parties, one lawyer But that's probably for a different different podcast to go into that. But ordinarily, you wouldn't bring your ex-partner with you, but you can bring somebody. So you can bring a friend, you can bring a family member, and sometimes it can be really helpful to have someone there just for, firstly, emotional support, and secondly, because we tend to throw a lot of information at people in that first meeting. And it can be a lot to take in. And sometimes it's just nice to have somebody else that's been there, that's listened to it, that you can then digest it with over a cup of coffee afterwards. So that can be quite helpful. And then the second thing that I find really helpful is when somebody comes to a meeting with a list of questions. And I find that really helpful because I won't necessarily go through the questions one by one. But what we'll do at the end of the meeting, after we've had our sort of general discussion, is I'll ask them to look at their questions. Is there anything that we haven't covered during the meeting? And then they can go through it and we can cover off any of those. And I think that's quite important because often when you're in the meeting and we're having these discussions, if those questions aren't written down, you get that moment where people leave and then they're like, that's the one that I wanted to ask and I completely forgot about it. So it's just making sure that we can cover off all of those things.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. I think I do love a list of questions as well, and you tend to find that you get to the end and then they flip through the questions and go, "Oh, you've already answered most of them." By and large, if you've sort of done a fairly thorough job in that meeting. So I think that kind of, in terms of the first practical steps, that's kind of most of the stuff, and then you start then you're getting into the process of sorting things out. So I think approaching things in that way and thinking about, okay, what's the interim status? Where's everyone living at? How's the money sort for that? How are we going to sort the money out for that? How are we going to adapt the children? And then arming yourself with the knowledge, getting the advice, and underpinning all that is the emotional support. What we should probably talk about is actually taking a step back chronologically from all that, because I think all that is stuff that really, in a lot of cases, not necessarily, in some that it can be before and after, but a lot of that, if you're on the receiving end, that's going to come after you've been told about the news. So that that leads to the question is, how do you have that conversation? An incredibly tough conversation, but the conversation of, I don't think I'm very happy, I think we might need to separate. I mean, Lisa, have you got any advice of things that you've heard from clients where you think it's worked, or stuff that people have done that really doesn't work and needs to be avoided? That discussion about the end of the marriage, because obviously we get clients who say, I'm thinking of ending the marriage, I haven't had the conversation yet, I'm scoping out what that would mean for me legally. What do you say to those clients about having the actual conversation?
Yeah, I mean, every relationship is different, isn't it? And the style of the conversation will probably change depending on the relationship that they have with their partner or their ex-partner. I suppose one thing to caveat this with is safety issues. So if there's any possibility that there are going to be safety issues in relation to this conversation, then first of all you need to have a plan as to what's going to happen. And we've done podcasts in the past, and there's lots of information on various domestic abuse charities websites as to making that plan moving forward. But have a plan. So if you need to go as far as having a bag packed, in the boot, etc., then make sure that's done before that conversation takes place. And also in those circumstances, it might be that having a conversation in the house, just the two of you, is not the best course of action, that it needs to take place somewhere more public, or it needs to take place in a more restricted format, whether that be, ideally, I would usually say text messages and emails are not the best way to be breaking this information to people, but equally, we have to put safety first in these situations. So putting that to a side, let's assume that there are no safety issues. Then ideally the conversation should be had somewhere private. It should be sitting the person down, explaining your feelings, but also giving them the opportunity to initially be quite shocked and upset about it. Because as Matt said, they're not going to immediately be on the same page as you, and this might have come completely out of the blue. So I think it's quite important to perhaps not get into that defending yourself situation. Give them the information, and then be prepared that they're going to have to go away and really think about that, and then perhaps come back for a second discussion. I think is usually the best way of doing it once they have had the opportunity to process a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think timing is really key. You're going to know the time that's going to work best Don't do it the day before your spouse has got a huge day at work and a big presentation on. Don't do it in 20 minutes before the kids are coming through the door. If you can make sure the kids are at a grandparent's or something, that can be really helpful. You're going to know the times that work and the times that don't. Be prepared for it not to be one conversation, but a series of conversations. Absolutely, like giving time and giving space to breathe is really important there. I think there's a lot in terms of language. I think, there are probably a lot of these conversations that descend into, well, I'm doing this because you always ... And I think thinking about your language and thinking about I statements rather than you statements is really helpful. I feel that, I'm not happy in the relationship, that I am, I feel like I'm unloved. I feel like that I'm unappreciated. It's a very different thing to hear than you always ... You do not, you do this, you do not. And it's never going to be an easy conversation. I'm not going to say that using the I phrase, this is going to magically make things, sunshines and kittens and rainbows, but it becomes a lot less blame focused. And the legal system, obviously, in the past few years has moved away from blame when we talk about fault divorce and no fault divorce. And I think reflecting that in the conversation is really helpful. But it's not one conversation. It's a series of conversations, probably over a prolonged period of time. And it comes back to that time piece of giving people a chance to breathe and to react, and to accept that, in all probability, unless there's been, you obviously get lots of mutual situations of some people that might say, yeah, I completely agree, I think that's time to go. But I think in the majority of situations, there tends to be someone who is driving it and someone who, while they might understand the drivers, is behind that. I think there has to be a space for that reaction to take place. Which is all, extremely depressing, and, it's not a fun thing to have to do. I think that, that trying to, but allowing it to be depressing and not trying to put a positive spin on things in those initial conversations.
And saying it as well. I mean, again, I don't want to talk about bereavements, but it's very akin to a conversation that you might have with children about how, somebody's passed on, or, they've gone to a better place. You've got to say it. You've got to make it very clear. If that's what it's not a case of, oh, I'm not sure. If you've made that decision, it's almost a little bit of being cruel to be kind. You do need to, don't say it bluntly and don't say it cruelly, but you do need to make it very clear what your position on it is as well, so that there's no interpretation that can go on for the other party, so that they can start that process of working through that without thinking that there's potentially a possibility that the relationship can be fixed.
Unless of course you think that there is a possibility, and if that's the case, there's a podcast in the feed with Dr. Sue Palmer-Con about, should I stay or should I go, about discernment counselling and the decision to end the marriage. So I'd encourage everyone to listen to that, to think about how to end the marriage if you're about to have that conversation and whether it's right for you. Do we want to kind of close this one with our sort of usual kind of top tips then, Lisa, in terms of if you are at that stage of getting going, for you, what are the first things to do if you're getting divorced?
So I think it kind of, what I'm going to say probably amalgamates some of the things that we've discussed about, but I think it's setting expectations. So early on, setting your expectations. So that's, looking at what your assets are, looking at, getting that advice, etc. Because I think if you can get your expectations right as to how the procedure is going to be and what things are going to potentially look like right from the beginning, I think it puts you on a better foot moving forward. And that's just understanding things like the length of time that a divorce can take to be dealt with. It's understanding that, actually the majority of cases don't go to courts. Most people do not have to go to a court hearing. Can't promise that yours won't be one that doesn't, but for the vast majority of the cases we deal with, they are settled out of court. So considering things like that, considering the fact that actually the law isn't biased, there's no favoritism towards men or women. We have maintenance payments going either way, for example, and understanding that we can only divide what's there. So if we're taking one house and we're making it into two, it might mean that there has to be a bit of change in lifestyle or movement, and kind of getting your head around that early on. And just understanding the different options that you have available to you. So, you can sit down with your partner and have a conversation. You can go to mediation. You can have communication via solicitors. You can do collaborative law. There's so many different options that don't involve rushing off to court for a court order. So my advice would be just set your expectations, do your research right at the beginning, so that that first step that you then take is done as positively as it can be.
Yeah, that's all great advice. I think my top tip is take your time. Take time. Don't rush it. This especially applies to the person who is driving things, who is instigating it. Is allow your partner time to react, to breathe, to grieve the end of the relationship. And putting time pressure on in the early stages is so counterproductive. I don't think people make the best decisions then. I don't think it's fair. I think it tends to result in people feeling a bit bullied and a bit pressured. So taking your time and just allowing you to adapt, allowing your spouse to adapt, and allowing your children to adapt to the new normal before you delve into what can be a fairly complicated legal process. So I think that's my one takeaway message from this podcast, if nothing else.
Perfect. So that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for listening. If you would like more information on our podcast, head over to stowtalks.co.uk, and please rate, like, share and review this podcast where you can.